Hi, this is going to be a two-part webcast on sensory disabilities and technology, achieving competitive integrated employment. My name is Rachael Rounds. I manage our Business Connections program at VCU's Rehab Research and Training Center. And then I'm going to toss it to Mike Fish and Greg Chittum for their introductions, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of this webcast.
I'm Mike Fish. I am an accessibility consultant, a teacher of blind students in technology, as well as an access technology user myself.
And I'm Greg Chittum. I am with the Virginia Rehab Center for the Blind and Vision Impaired in Richmond. I am the coordinator for community engagement there, where I help to plan and put on special events, virtual events, employment-related events, and a big youth summer program as well. So,
and thank you guys for joining us for this. This is going to be a two-part webcast, and in the first part, we'd like to just lay a little bit of groundwork about individuals with sensory disabilities and what we need to think about when it comes to employment. And then the second piece of this is going to be focused on the technology that is out there that can help and aid in successful employment outcomes for individuals with sensory disabilities. So let's go ahead and just get into this. And Mike, I'm going to throw this one to you. Can you tell me some important considerations for employers to think about when they're hiring individuals who are blind or have vision impairments?
Certainly, I think one of the biggest things is to have an open mind about things. Persons with disabilities can do things that persons without disabilities can do. They just may do it in a different way. So that may mean that they access the computer in a different way, or they need specific accommodations, or there needs to be captioning for content that has, specifically audio content, so or sign language interpretation, things like that, that may need to be handled, and things may be done differently, but the tasks can still be accomplished. Other considerations, we might dive more to in part two a little bit, but is accessibility. It's making things accessible to everyone. So that may mean things like having your website compliant, meaning it meets the regulations that are out there for web accessibility guidelines. It may mean that you have alternative texts to your picture so that there's a description that go along with the picture that you use on your website. That, accessibility is from the ground up. It's from the posting you're putting out there to get someone to apply for your position, all the way through, the onboarding process, that your paperwork that you're going to have them complete, to doing the task that you hired them for, the platform that you're utilizing to get your tasks completed.
Those are great points, especially when you're talking about, not just can the person use the program, or can the person access a restroom, but we need to be thinking about this at the application level even. So those are great points. Greg, do you have anything that you want to add on?
Well, I think I'd like to reiterate what Mike said at the very beginning, is just, open-minded. What should employers be mindful of? I think it would be wonderful if employers would just be bringing an open mind regarding employing people with sensory disabilities. I think that as simple as that sounds, that really is, I think, the biggest barrier. And in the research, it comes out as employer attitudes. And well, what does that mean regarding someone who is blind or has a sensory disability? I think in this particular case, and we see it quite a bit, a lot of our society just has never met a blind person. Mm-hmm. And that right there, they're extremely innocent in their ignorance, but it's a true ignorance, and people just really don't know. They can't imagine how they would live without their vision, how they would work and do work tasks. And that's exactly the big, we need to educate, and it's very, very tedious. It tends to happen one person at a time. And it's just a long kind of slow momentum kind of process that we're in the middle of, and we're making gains. But what should accessibility, absolutely, I'm sure we'll get into that. But if people in our society would just be open-minded about the opportunities for people to work with vision impairments, that would be, and sensory disabilities in general, that would be fantastic.
Well, that's kind of a good, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
If I can jump in really quick, I want to hit on the opportunities piece.
Yeah.
Give the opportunities, just because, as an employer, you may not know how it can be done. It doesn't mean it can't be done, and you have to provide that. It will never be done if you don't provide that person the opportunity to show you how they do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think where both of you are heading is a great segue into kind of my next conversation. Next question, how can an employment specialist, what should they know and take into consideration? A lot of people that are going to be watching these webcasts are going to be new employment specialists, maybe rehab counselors. What, as advocates, can we do when we're talking about working with individuals with sensory disabilities?
Take that first. One of the biggest things is to work with the individual with a sensory disability, figure out what are their strengths, what do they bring to the table, what can they do, what are they comfortable with. Another thing is educate yourself in what it is with that that person with a disability might be having to deal with, or how they might achieve the tasks, or what technologies out there for them to use, and really ask the tough questions that employers may not want to ask but want the answers to. Transportation, how are you going to get to work and back if that's a concern? How are you going to accomplish the job tasks that are listed in the posting with the technology that you use? And if they don't have answers to that and you do, feel free to share that. But also, you almost want to work yourself out of a job. You want to be, and you guys know this, is you want to make it so that that person is as independent as possible. And the best way to do that is to not necessarily be the liaison between the employer and the employee, but to be the support for the employee, support in the sense of encouragement and pushing for them to advocate for themselves, kind of being a behind the scenes almost, as opposed to a go-between.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, that might mean some employment specialists have to switch their way of thinking a little bit, because oftentimes we might be working with somebody on the autism spectrum or somebody with an intellectual disability, and they may need more hands-on instruction, whereas somebody with a sensory disability, that may be, it may just be that they can't hear or that they can't see, and that there's no cognitive deficit there, and they don't need as much support to learn their jobs necessarily. So I just kind of throw that out there, because I know that when I work with you guys, with your agency, Greg, and I have to, switch my train of thinking and step back and just be supportive, and not necessarily tell somebody or show somebody or model how to do their job. So I like that point. It's, might employ different strategies when working with people who have vision impairments.
Well, you do have to switch your mindset, and it's hard, but it's very possible. And hearing that story reminded me when I was hired at VRCBVI, I was hired as an orientation mobility, a cane travel teacher. And prior to that, I had been working with young students in K-12 schools. And even it wasn't, in this case, a different disability group. These were kids with vision impairments, but they're kids. And because they're kids, they have different abilities, And so
right.
Working with a third grader is different than working with a guy who's 33 and has a work history and went to college, and I remember being a very brand new orientation mobility instructor at the center, and really thinking about my experience with kids. But now I've got this guy who had college graduate, and the only thing that didn't work with him were his eyes.
Mhm.
Okay, everything else, he was just an excellent, very, very, very capable person. And I remember giving him an independent assignment, to go down, into a residential neighborhood, and he used to do that by himself. And I remember having to I felt like I needed to tape myself to my chair to give him that. I did not want to rob him of that opportunity to learn something for himself.
Mhm.
And I knew, but that was not my inclination. My inclination was with these kids and to help.
Yeah.
But I knew the most helpful thing to do in that moment was to sit right there in my office. So it does require a mindset change, but it's very doable.
Well,
I like your point of not robbing them of the opportunity, Greg.
yeah.
You don't want to rob them of that chance to be independent. Again, if you do for them, you don't know what they can do for themselves, and so you want to be careful of not stepping in prematurely if necessary.
Yeah, so now my brain's going in different directions because I want to talk about O&M, and I want to talk about being passive versus being active. And, maybe we can touch on that. Mike, you were talking earlier about food just shows up sometimes, for somebody who's blind. And I think that's a really great example of how when we're just trying to help people, we're actually hindering their success and their independence.
Sure, I can elaborate on that a bit if you like. With that kind of analogy I was using is, as a blind kid myself, and I know from other experiences with other blind kids, they don't always know where the food comes from. It's just plopped in front of them. They eat it. They leave the table. The food goes away. We're not always at a restaurant, so that's not how this works. So they don't understand that concept of someone's got to prepare it in the kitchen, and this is how it gets on the plate. And no, it doesn't come cut up for you. You actually, someone did that for you. Sometimes. And it's the passive way of just sitting there and expecting that plate to show up in front of you, as opposed to actively going in the kitchen, making your plate, figuring out where things are, figuring out how to do things. And that doesn't just come naturally. Sometimes you have to get some training on that, perhaps, or ask for assistance. But it's different than expecting it to occur. Asking for help is fine and necessary, and what you should do. Expecting something to just appear because you want it to, or because that's how it's always been, is completely different. And I think to put that in an employment perspective is, especially as an employment specialist, it's doing less for the individual is really giving them the opportunity to do more for themselves. So you may have all the greatest intentions of, I really want to get them this job. I really want to help them do this. But if they don't want it, if they want to just be passive and let you do for them, then you might as well take that job and do it yourself, because you're the one who's gotten them into it. And I think that's the way to consider that is they need to take an active role. That's why I mentioned earlier, stepping back, working yourself out of a job. They need to be able to take the control, take the lead in their employment journey. And that is being active about it, going out, researching jobs, figuring out what the job lead entails. How are they going to accomplish the tasks that they want to apply for? And then doing that job and advocating for their needs. What are their needs? What do they need? What is the technology they need to learn? If they already know it, great. If they don't, how do they learn it? And maybe that's where, as an employment specialist, you say, maybe some training is necessary, in a specific thing like a screen reader or something. And them getting that training proves that they're actively invested in their employment journey.
Mhm. Yeah, those are great points. Greg, you talked about O&M. What is O&M?
Orientation and mobility. And that's a fancy way of saying, you know, getting around with a cane or a dog or whatever. But basically the skills to know where you are and where you want to go and how to, and getting there with either low vision or no vision at all. And I do, and Rachel, I know that active versus passive is something that you and I have talked a lot about, and that's impact. I've learned that a lot, learned a lot about that from working at VRC BVI. But you know, I think you know, with how you get around, with how a blind person learns stuff, okay, pretty much anything. There was a really interesting article when I was going through my training. A blind girl came home and said, "Dad, where's our plunger?" And he's like, "It's in the bathroom." "Why?" "I've never seen a plunger. You know, I want to take a look at it." And the dad, knowing that in order for her to look at the plunger, she was going to, you know, tactily explore. And he goes, "You know what? Probably let's go to Home Depot where they've got some clean new plungers." So they went to Home Depot, and she looked at the plunger. Well, and in talking about the plunger, she's learning the concept of what it's used for. Well, wait a minute. I mean, her experience with a toilet has been very not servicing the toilet. I'll just put it that way.
Right.
And
right.
so but that led to looking at a toilet, looking at the plumbing, and just concept after concept after concept that we with vision can just visually watch, you know, or observe in just a moment. You have to be that much more intentional with someone who's blind. And that that does not mean that we just talk and describe and talk and describe. I think the best teachers that I've ever seen who work with folks who are blind are there in a very consultative manner. So so for you know, job coaches, for employment specialists, I would encourage them to be you know, kind of hands off, really encouraging movement, encouraging exploration. And that's gonna, like I mentioned, I felt like I needed to tape myself to my desk chair. You're going to experience some discomfort because you're going to see that person doing either moving with a cane, and the cane is hitting things. Well, that's what a cane is supposed to do. You know, that's how they get information through the cane. I'm sorry, for people who are blind get information with the cane. But it's going to be the same thing with a work-related task as well. As long, and that's why that story that I shared about the girl, that's the perfect scenario. She came and said, "Hey, Dad, I want to see a plunger." And that's what I would like for the job coaches to be
encouraging
is just taking an interest in your surroundings, taking an active role in your environment, and then the learning just happens.
So Mike, when somebody might need some O&M instruction on a job site, what does that look like? What is there anything expected of the employer in that piece of employment when they first start?
Well, it's going to be uncomfortable a little bit, I think, for the employee. Probably for the employer a little bit too, and the coworkers perhaps, but for the employee, because it's going to be a new environment. You know, some folks who, if they need O&M instruction on the job site, a lot of folks, depending on the training that they have, we don't need a ton of training. We can figure it out as we go. It's going to be slower, perhaps the first couple of days, than, you know, before we get familiar with the area. You know, but some people may need an O&M instructor to come in and do that training. You know, and if that's something that needs to occur, I'd encourage that to occur after working hours, weekends maybe, or if that can't be arranged, the employer could think about possibly opening up the establishment just for a little bit of time so that person can get comfortable with the establishment, or suggest a time when it's not as busy or things aren't going on that person can, the person's blind can really get in there and explore. And go back to what Greg mentioned, it was, exploring the environment. We learn nothing as blind people, really, if someone's just describing it to us, as opposed to if we experience it ourselves and go in there and walk the halls, if you will, find the rooms, figure out our way of thinking, because everyone's brain's wired a little differently. We all think differently. Some of us are visual learners. Some of us, need to remember it's 3 turns to the left and then a turn to the right, third door down on the left, whatever it ends up being, that you come and figure out as you perform the task and find that. Some people want route travel. So this is the route I need to take to get to where I need to go. And that doesn't need to be done in front of coworkers. I think the fact that, if you're going to get O&M instruction on the job site, it sets a kind of a tone I wouldn't necessarily want to send, which is that this employee is going to need a lot of help, and the employer might think this employee needs a lot of help. I don't have the time to walk with this person from place to place or get someone to do it for me or that kind of thing. Whereas if the training's done when other coworkers aren't around, it doesn't present that tone. Also, as an employment specialist, encourage that individual to ask for assistance, but be specific in what they ask for. Don't be passive and wait. I've heard a story where someone needs to use a restroom and they almost didn't make it because they waited until someone else was going so that they could follow that person to the restroom, as opposed to asking, excuse me, where's the restroom, or can you give me directions to the restroom, as opposed to, can you take me there? Mm-hmm. Or just waiting to follow somebody, who said they needed to go to the restroom or that kind of thing. So interesting example, but I think it gets the point across that really encouraging the employee to advocate for their needs effectively is a way to work with the O&M situation.
Do you think that more people than not, or fewer people than not, need that kind of O&M instruction? Or, and I'm sorry if I'm just asking you for numbers that you might not have, but in your experience.
In my experience, I think fewer need that direct piece, mm-hmm. but it all kind of depends on their training and their confidence in their own abilities too. Some folks are trained that they can navigate independently, taking public transportation, going anywhere they want to go without O&M, because they've gotten that training prior and their confidence is there in themselves that they can do it. Others may never have been given that opportunity to travel independently. They've always held on to somebody's arm, or they've always been guided to the places they needed to go. And so they're not comfortable in a new environment, and it will take some time. So I always find, people with disabilities are a cross section of society. So you're going to have that situation where it's, some are more comfortable, doing certain things than others,
Gotcha. Greg, do you have anything you want to add to that? If not, we can wrap up part 1 and then move into the technology piece, if you guys don't have any additional thoughts on what we've talked about so far. No?
Nope. If we can if that active versus passive, if we can cultivate a level of taking action from the person who is blind in their environment, and a willingness, an open-minded willingness to try something from the employer, and a relatively hands-off approach from the job coaches, just to allow for time. for the blind person to get into a situation, and from the employer too, allow the blind person to get in, take action, use alternative techniques, and learn. I really do think we'll have some pretty great outcomes.
I agree. I think one of the big things is, from an employment specialist standpoint of, if you're going to come up with a solution for that individual to do their job or to do a task, a part of that job, you've already done the hard work for them. What incentive do they have to think of a solution for themselves, to really be active in their journey of employment, in their quest, if you will, to get that job and maintain it, if you're going to keep providing solutions for them left and right? Is it your job or is it their job? And if the goal is it to be their job, the one they applied for, the one that they interviewed for, the one that they've walked in the door to sit down at that desk or behind that food counter or whatever the case may be, they need to be in charge of that from the start to the finish. And as an employment specialist, rely on you for ideas, encouragement, behind the scenes support to get to where they need to be.
Really great points. Okay, well, we will wrap up part 1 of this webcast and stick around and watch part 2.